Sought for that purpose. Is there anyone opposed to that course of action? There is.
Mr. Chair.
Speaker, David Clark.
Mr. Chair.
David Clark.
Mr. Chair, I rise to speak to part one of this bill in the committee stages. Mr. Ryle earlier spoke of a mandate for these sales, and I think that he did that willfully, knowing that in fact that is not the mood of the nation. The nation is opposed to these sales, and in great numbers. More people, in fact, in the election voted for parties, Mr. Chair, that opposed this legislation than parties that supported it. And in fact, in Select Committee, just 0.6%, that's 0.6 of 1% of submissions, were in favour of this legislation, and we received over 1,400 submissions in that Select Committee. One submitter likened the selling of these assets to being like selling your kidneys to pay for dialysis, Mr. Chair. The mood of those submitters was very clear. They wanted to send a very clear message to the government that the general public do not support these sales. And in fact, over the weekend, somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 people in Dunedin, the ODT says, were out marching against the sale of these assets. So for Mr. Ryle to claim a mandate is a very bold move, and I would suggest a foolish one. People are marching in the street against this legislation. It was a terrible rushed process, and Mr. Todd McClay just alluded to the process. He said there have been many comments about the rushed nature of the process, and that is true. Submitters were clipped. Many submitters were clipped, questions were limited, and they were not allowed more than 5 minutes generally, unless they were representing an organisation. And Mr. McClay now says that's rubbish. Well, I think if we ask the submitters again, many of them who complained at the time, they would restate that that process was not one that they considered desirable or sufficient in the democratic sense. Teleconferences were called at short notice, so meaning some people could not attend them. And the legislation was sent 5 weeks early back to the House, as David Parker noted, without advice from the Treasury on some subjects which we thought advice was warranted. These decisions should not be taken lightly, and particularly where taxpayer is put at risk of additional charges in electricity, and also at risk of losing dividends, where treaty risks exist, and these parts are all relevant to part one of the legislation. I want to speak to them in a little more detail as I go on. We had no ability to ask questions of Treasury, who had in fact already drafted their report before we heard all of the oral submissions. The Treasury had drafted their report before we had heard all of the submissions. Outrageous. That is the kind of process we've seen here. This government is afraid that its support parties will walk away. They know that this is not a done deal in the pure sense of the word, that some of those support parties may just walk away because they realise that it is not a process that has been transparent and fair. They put a back-down clause in the legislation, and we would say to them that there's a simpler way of doing this. It's simply to back down before the legislation passes, Mr. Chair. Now, I want to speak specifically about the removal of social responsibility clause from the governance arrangements for these companies. This will have a chilling effect, I would suggest, on the way these companies operate. No longer will the Crown be able to investigate in the same way any poor practices, anything that put lives at risk in terms of the management of electricity, if brownouts or blackouts affect people in their homes. If, as we heard one submitter from Grey Power suggest, people will freeze to death because of this legislation, Mr. Chair, there will be no comeback. In the past, where there have been issues that have been raised, and I think of the terrible Muliinga situation where life support went off with the power, there was an accountability. The government was called to account on that matter. And Mr. Chair, that is removed with this change in legislation. There will be no social responsibility clause that says that the government should be answerable for the power staying on, for making sure that people do not freeze to death in their homes. Mr. Chair, it's also true that treaty obligations are being removed from private investors. Currently, that treaty obligations in the SOE legislation apply to the Crown. The Crown has to take treaty matters into account as it considers its actions, as it buys and sells parts of the operation. And the risk is that there's a likely, Mr. Chair,
David Clark.
that with the sale of individual assets made more possible with a large private stake in these things, that future settlement options may be sold off. And Māori interests have raised this concern with the government. The government is putting all of the obligation for these treaty risks on the taxpayer, but it's actually taking away its ability to manage and control them by leaving the private shareholders without that risk open to influence the decision-making process. And of course there are concerns about kaitiakitanga, along with those other concerns about assets being sold off. Mr. Chair, one of the other frightening aspects of the proposed change rules is the removal of Official Information Act oversight. And the reason given for this by the government is that these operations should be able to operate commercially, as other private commercial operators do. Well, they do actually now. And the fact is that they have been running and returning good dividends to the Crown with no impediment caused by the Official Information Act legislation. There are indeed commercial protections in that legislation that make sure that the operations are protected in terms of any commercial risks that may otherwise be disclosed through the Act. So we have that protection there already. The Ombudsman took the unusual step of appearing before the Select Committee to outline the risks of removing the state-owned assets from that legislation. And she said that they believe in a fair, just and transparent scrutiny of majority publicly owned companies, and they believe that this should continue. There is no evidence that commercial interests will be harmed by removing these assets from the OIA legislation. In fact, what we heard from several submitters are that there are indeed risks that go along with removing these operations from the OIA legislation. One of those risks is that the companies will act in a way that's not transparent and fair. We don't know, we won't be able to research as easily as we have been. Members of the public will no longer be able to put in Official Information Act requests to find out how decisions were made even when they're majority public owned, which seems a strange way of going, particularly when there are treaty risks, as I've just outlined, and social responsibility risks that go with the changing of this legislation. So it was a very rare submission from the Ombudsman, and one that expressed a great degree of concern at the changes. In fact, if I quote from the Ombudsman's submission, the Ombudsman said, "In our view, any possible advantage that may be seen in the mixed ownership model companies being removed from the Ombudsman's jurisdiction under the OA and OIA appears to be minimal, if not illusory, and needs to be balanced against the public interest in maintaining their accountability to the public of New Zealand, so long as the Crown retains a majority interest in them. We see no reason in principle for their removal, particularly given the potential removal of other accountability requirements." It doesn't get much stronger than that, Mr. Chair, in terms of the Ombudsman's willingness to step in and speak at a select committee process. Mr. Chair, we heard from further from the Ombudsman the risks around the risks of profitability or otherwise. There just seems to be no reason for doing this. We also heard concerns about cronyism in terms of board appointments and the processes that sit behind the board appointments no longer being able to be examined. And we also found many researchers willing to say that they were concerned about these changes. Mr. Chair, these are strategic assets that are being sold off. Mr. Key gave his personal commitment to keep 85 to 90% New Zealand owned, and I'll quote him. He said, "We're giving people a commitment that 85 to 90% of the entire company will be owned by New Zealanders. That's my commitment to them tonight as Prime Minister," he said in the Leaders' Debate in November last year. Mr. Chair, well, there's no provision for that in the legislation. So not only do we have these concerning removals of social responsibility, of treaty obligation, steps of Official Information Act oversight, but we have a commitment from Mr. Key that is not worth the words that make it up, because there is no mechanism there to ensure that these strategic assets remain in New Zealand ownership. The mechanism simply is not there. Mr Chair, they've inserted the back-down clause, and as I've said earlier, I hope that they use it. We know that the power prices will go up. The private companies have significantly higher power prices, and as I said earlier, the Treasury was not given time, Mr Chair, to come back to us on that.
Sage.
Thank you, Mr Chair. The Finance Minister said earlier today that